On the night of July 20th, 1944, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg was shot in a courtyard in Berlin. He had placed a bomb under Hitler's conference table earlier that day, but Hitler had survived the assassination attempt. Operation Valkyrie, a plan years in the making, drawing in German army officers, government officials, and civilians to kill Hitler, seize control of the Reich, and negotiate peace with the Allied powers, had collapsed. But Stauffenberg was not the only victim of the Nazi reprisals. Most of those behind the plot were dead or in custody before the night was over. And Hitler was not finished with the conspirators. He had not yet come for their families. 2 days later, Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front, broadcast a demand on national radio. It is not sufficient just to seize the culprits and bring them ruthlessly to account. The whole brood must be wiped out. Heinrich Himmler was the man who turned Ley's broadcast into action. He was head of the SS, Hitler's personal security force. Through it, he oversaw the Gestapo, the secret state police that ran surveillance, made arrests, and fed prisoners into the concentration camps he also commanded. In the direct aftermath of July 20th, Hitler also appointed him chief of the Home Army, handing him command of Germany's entire reserve military force. Himmler then directed the Gestapo and local Nazi Party officials to begin identifying the relatives of every man implicated in the plot, wives, children, parents, siblings, and removing them. None were charged, none were tried. A blood connection to the wrong person was the only evidence required. This policy had a name, Sippenhaft, or kin liability, and Himmler was the man who would carry it out. For von Stauffenberg's wife and children, it was already coming. Nina von Stauffenberg had already learned on the morning of July 21st what had happened. She was alone with her 4 children at the family estate at Lautlingen while 3 months pregnant. She gathered the children and told them their father was dead. The Gestapo would come. It was only a matter of when. The knock on the door came on the night of July 22nd. Gestapo officers took Nina from the estate and left the children behind under guard. She was interrogated and transferred to Ravensbrück, Germany's largest women's concentration camp, pregnant in solitary confinement, and with every letter she received heavily censored. But at some point, she learned that her own mother, Anna von Lerchenfeld, had been brought to the same camp. Her immediate thought was whether her mother could get news of the children to her, but solitary confinement made contact impossible. However, one letter eventually reached her from Nina von Stauffenberg, her sister-in-law, who had visited the children at Christmas. While Nina was in Ravensbrück, her children had been moved to Bad Sachsa in August 1944, a former children's convalescent home in the Harz Mountains, now under Gestapo control. Berthold was 12 years old. Heimeran was 8. Franz Ludwig was 6. The youngest, Valerie, was 4. They arrived among strangers and were immediately divided into separate huts by age and sex. The Gestapo then took their family photographs and letters, stripped name tags from their clothing, and each child was issued with new personal items, hairbrushes, combs, engraved with the new name the Gestapo forced them to use. The name Stauffenberg had been taken from them. They were now the Meister children. At its peak, Bad Sachsa held 44 children from 18 families. Among them were the children of Caesar von Hofacker, a Luftwaffe officer who had coordinated the conspiracy in occupied Paris, who was arrested and executed in December 1944, and the grandchildren of Carl Goerdeler, the conspirators' designated chancellor, who was captured in August 1944 and executed in February 1945. All of them were the children of men connected to the July 20th plot, and every one of them had been forced into a new identity. Nina knew the children were alive but had no way to contact or reach them. And as the weeks passed, she had no way of knowing whether they were still at Bad Sachsa. Then, in early January 1945, she was transferred, removed from Ravensbrück, and taken to a Nazi maternity home near Frankfurt. The Gestapo had registered her under a false name, Nina Schank, and under that name, On January 27th, she gave birth to a daughter, Constanze. In the weeks following the assassination attempt, the Gestapo did not just target the Stauffenberg family. Colonel Georg-Alexander Hansen had run military intelligence for the conspirators and was executed on September 8, 1944. His 5 children were taken into custody, including an infant who had been alive for less than 2 weeks. Hansen's case showed what happened to the family of a man already in custody, but another case would show what happened to the families of those who had yet to be caught. General Fritz Lindemann, chief of artillery of the Home Army and one of the conspirators, went into hiding after July 20th. The Gestapo arrested his wife and held her as a hostage and sent his 10-year-old daughter to Bad Sachsa. When Lindemann was finally captured and fatally wounded in September, the reprisals against his family still did not stop. His 72-year-old uncle, retired Major Max Lindemann, was detained along with his wife. She died in custody 4 days later, while Max Lindemann remained in custody until the end of the war. The families of conspirators who had been captured were already in the Gestapo's hands, but the families of those who had escaped were no safer. Major Joachim Kuhn, a general staff officer, crossed to the Soviet lines to avoid capture. As part of the reprisals, the Gestapo detained his father and mother and arrested his fiancée, who was the cousin of the man who had placed the bomb for the assassination attempt. She knew nothing of the plot but was interrogated anyway, separated from her family and held in a series of prisons. But the reprisals against the families of the conspirators were far from over. Subscribe now and keep watching to find out how much further they would reach. The reach of Sippenhaft did not stop at Germany's borders. Families living outside the country were no safer than those within it. Fay von Hassell, who was the daughter of Ulrich von Hassell, a diplomat executed for his role in the conspiracy, was living in occupied Italy under her married name when the SS arrested her in late September 1944. At Innsbruck, her 2 young sons were taken from her, but the SS did not simply detain them. On Himmler's personal orders, the Ministry of the Interior issued the boys entirely new birth certificates, false names, invented places of birth, and named the SS as their legal guardian. Fay was held in detention until Germany surrendered, but even then, her sons were not located until July 1945, 2 months after the war ended, and Fay herself did not learn of their fate for a further 2 months after this. But the threat of Sippenhaft could also be turned against men who were still alive. What happened to Erwin Rommel showed exactly how. Under interrogation, Carl Goerdeler had named Rommel as the future president of the Germany they planned to build. Rommel had never spoken to Goerdeler, but his name was in the reports, and Hitler had seen it. On October 14, 1944, Generals Burgdorf and Mazel arrived at his home in Herrlingen with a cyanide capsule. What they offered him was a choice of death. Take the capsule, and there would be no reprisals against his wife Lucy and his son Manfred. His pension and property would not be seized. His death would be announced as wounds sustained in Normandy, and he would be buried with full military honors. But refuse, and he would be dragged before a people's court and tried as a traitor, and his family would have none of those protections. Rommel said goodbye to his wife and son, got into the car with Burgdorf and Mazel, and was dead before it reached the hospital. 4 days later, Germany buried the Desert Fox with full military honors. And Lucy sat in the hall, knowing exactly how her husband had died, and so did their son Manfred, who would later state, "We knew the families of the plotters had been taken to concentration camps. No one knew what happened to them. The only chance of survival for us lay in his death." For the families Rommel's guarantee had not covered, the wives, parents, and children already in Gestapo custody, with no deal to accept, there was no equivalent protection. By the time the initial wave of arrests had run its course, approximately 140 people had been taken into custody under Sippenhaft, and that figure was conservative. It did not account for the hundreds of others subjected to punishment battalions, forced labor, property confiscation, and other forms of persecution. But of those arrested, not all remained in custody. By mid-October 1944, the Gestapo had consolidated the most significant group of kin prisoners, 22 in total, at the Hindenburg Bad, an isolated mountain hotel. On November 30th, they were loaded onto trucks without being told where they were going. The trucks transported them east to Stutthof concentration camp in East Prussia, arriving on December 2nd. But in January 1945, Soviet forces advancing from the east forced the camp's evacuation. The prisoners were moved first to Moskau, a camp outside Danzig, and it was there, on February 6th, that Nina von Stauffenberg's mother, Anna von Lerchenfeld, died of typhus. She had been held at Ravensbrück while her daughter was in solitary confinement in the same camp, separated and never permitted to communicate with her, and she would never see her again. From Moskau, the remaining prisoners boarded a train west and were described by one Nazi guard as living inventory. The group was eventually moved on to Dachau concentration camp. At Dachau, at the beginning of April 1945, other resistance prisoners in the same camp system were being executed on Hitler's personal orders. Among them were Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and General Hans Oster. The kin prisoners drew the obvious conclusion that they could be next. So scared were some that they ate as little as possible through fear of being poisoned. Others obtained what they believed was an antidote and administered it to themselves. On April 26th, they were loaded onto buses and driven south, but they were again not told where they were going. 4 days later, the convoy reached Niederdorf, a village technically in Italian territory, and within the operational command of Colonel General Wiedinghoff, commander of German Army Group C in Italy. Among the prisoners was Colonel von Bonin, who had been arrested for defying a military retreat order, but was still wearing his Wehrmacht uniform. He found a command post in the village and contacted Wiedinghoff's headquarters. He was personally acquainted with the general from his time on the Army High Command staff, warning that with Allied forces closing in, Wiedinghoff would be held personally responsible for any harm that came to the hostages. Wiedinghoff therefore ordered a Wehrmacht detachment to Niederdorf, and by the morning of April 30th, 150 soldiers had arrived and forced the SS guards to stand down. The prisoners were then transferred to the Hotel Praxer Wildsee in the mountains, where American forces liberated them on May 4th. While the adult prisoners had been moved across Europe for months before they were freed, the children at Bad Sachsa had simply stayed where they were, and American forces reached them on April 12th, 3 weeks before the adult prisoners were liberated. But liberation did not mean going home. They remained at the camp for weeks with no means of reuniting with their family. But then on May 4th, the new mayor of Bad Sachsa addressed them and told them they need not be ashamed of their names or their fathers. The Stauffenberg and Hofacker children were not collected until June 7th, when a great aunt arrived in a French military car, procured a bus, and drove them home. The last children at Bad Sachsa were the Goerdeler grandchildren, found still at the camp in late June, not by their own family, but by someone searching for entirely different missing children. They returned home in July 1945. The adult kin prisoners and the children received no formal release. They remained held until Hitler was dead and German forces had surrendered. And even then, freedom did not arrive through any order. Nina's release came in April 1945 because the field gendarme, assigned to guard her, had no orders left to follow. He told her he was leaving and walked away, leaving her stranded in Upper Franconia with infant Constanze, who was gravely ill since birth. With no money and nothing beyond the hat box she had packed the night the Gestapo came for her. The last she had known, her children were at Bad Sachsa, but months had passed, and she had no way of knowing whether they were still there. She was preparing to travel there herself when a car pulled up, carrying Lily Podolinsky, a friend of her mother-in-law, and beside her sat Berthold, Nina's eldest son. The children's great-aunt had already collected the 4 older children from Bad Sachsa and returned them to the family home in Lautlingen. The children had been told their parents had done something terrible, and for almost a year, not one of them had known whether their mother was alive. Now they did. The children had been taken to Bad Sachsa as Meisters and left as Stauffenbergs, and they did not disappear quietly. Berthold went on to serve 38 years in the West German Bundeswehr and retired as a major general. Franz Ludwig was elected to the German Bundestag and then the European Parliament. Heimeran settled in Zurich, and Constanza wrote a book about her mother. But Valerie alone did not live such a long life. She died of leukemia in 1966, aged only 25. Nina lived until the age of 92. Approximately 200 conspirators were executed for their direct involvement in the July 20th plot. But the purge extended far beyond them. 7,000 people were arrested in total, and 4,980 were executed. The families who were taken under Sippenhaft numbered approximately 140 by the initial count, though that figure did not include the hundreds more subjected to punishment battalions, forced labor, and property confiscation. The majority of those arrested were released by October 1944. The most significant group, the 22 adult kin prisoners, remained in custody until Germany surrendered. The conspirators' families had not tried to kill Hitler, but their blood relation to those implicated was enough for the Nazi state. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and to find out what happened to the men who built Hitler's Third Reich and what fate finally caught up with them, that video is on screen now.